Hey there, this is Ross Izzard. This is the Backcountry Fly Fishing Podcast, where we talk about fly fishing in more interesting places. So we spent a good chunk of the early part of this season talking about gear and weather and stuff that you need to be comfortable out there, because if you're not comfortable out there, you're probably going to have a bad time. You're not going to catch a lot of fish, and you're going to wind up going home early, which just kind of sucks when you're trying to be out there fly fishing. So we kind of had to cover that, because otherwise, it's just not going to work, and the rest of it doesn't really matter. But last week, we jumped into some of the specifics about how to find a winter fly fishing stream. Talked primarily about tailwaters. I did have a couple of folks reach out to me and remind me that there are spring creeks in some states that stay nice and warm on behalf of the fact that there is spring water coming out of the ground at a consistent temperature. That is definitely true. I don't have those near me. I have fished some of them in certain places, including Montana. If you're lucky enough to have one, then hey man, knock yourself out. Spring creeks are awesome in the wintertime if you've got one. And the same thing with other freestones. There are certain parts in the country where freestone rivers do stay fishable, or at least mostly fishable, for a good chunk of the winter season. Out west where I am, that just really isn't true. There might be a couple of exceptions, but in general, it is a tailwater game in the wintertime. If it's different where you are, then hey, do your thing, man. I have not fished everywhere in the country. I've fished all over, but there are exceptions to every rule. Rules are made to be broken. So hope that helps you find some place to go fishing. If you want to go fishing somewhere else and try it out, sweet. Go try it. Shoot me a line. Let me know how it goes. But this week, we are going to jump into the nitty gritty of actually fly fishing in the wintertime. We did a previous series on fly fishing through the fall, and we did it by month. So we had September and October, and I think we skipped November because we were just going to talk about wintertime. And now we're in December as I record this, which means that we can kind of lump them all together at this stage. The fall is variable enough in terms of temperature and conditions that we kind of have to break it out and be a little bit more granular. To be honest with you, the winter, once it really kicks off, and that is anywhere from mid-November through, December or so, and then lasting all the way until the end of February at least, often until the end of March, depending on where you happen to be. A lot of those months are pretty similar. They're cold. The water temperatures are not fluctuating super widely. The rivers that you're fishing are not fluctuating super widely. It's a fairly consistent game with, again, a couple of exceptions for most of the winter. And so we're going to talk about the nitty gritty of winter fly fishing overall. Some of this stuff, fair warning, is going to sound similar to the things that you heard in the October fly fishing podcast. That's because October, as I mentioned then, is kind of the transition month. And in certain places and at certain elevations, October can start to feel like the winter. So there's a reason that these are going to be sort of similar. The difference being that you're going to have fewer options as far as how you fish in the wintertime if you want to be effective. So with that, let's go ahead and jump in. It's going to be a pretty technical discussion. I want to walk you through the details of how all of this stuff works, because I think it matters. I think the wintertime is challenging and will test your skills and your knowledge and your abilities in a way that most of the other seasons will not. So, hey, if you're not nerdy and you just want the high level thing, then I don't know, dude, go find an article online that's, 300 words long and via con Dios desperado. But if you want to get nerdy about winter fly fishing, and specifically how I fly fish in the winter, this is the episode for you. So let's get rocking. Let's start with something that we've talked about quite a bit up to this point, which is that winter brings cold water temperatures. Shouldn't surprise you, right? Most of the streams that you fish, you are not going to see water temperatures much above the low 40s. In some cases, those are getting down to like the low to mid 30s. The lower you go, the harder the fishing gets. If you are below 34, go home. If you're below 36, give it a shot, but you might wind up going home. If you're in that sweet spot above 36, fish on, dude. The fish are probably doing something. It's not exact science, but in general, the colder those water temperatures get, the harder the fish get to catch. That's for two reasons that you probably already know from listening. The first is that trout are cold-blooded. Their metabolisms slow down as water temperatures go down, so they're not as hungry. They're not feeding as often. Feeding fish is tough, and then finding fish who are willing to make any effort to eat your flies is even tougher, even if they are feeding. And that demands a certain approach and a certain set of tactics that we'll talk about here in a second. But the other thing, and the thing that I think is likely the most important for you to keep in mind is that those lower water temperatures also send signals to the bugs. Fly fishing, as you probably know if you've been doing it for any length of time, is really less about the trout and more about the bugs, right? So we all like to post our pictures and act like we're super cool fly fishing bros with our beautiful cutthroat trout in these amazing places. And that's true. But the truth is we're also all bug nerds, right? So we're only like half a step away from the guy with the big, thick bifocals and the butterflies pinned on a board, pointing them out to children in a museum and reading out their Latin names so that he can sound super smart and explain how bugs are just so interesting. We're not far off from that, so don't laugh too hard at that guy the next time you see him in real life. Bugs are everything. So bug activity and the types of insects in a given stream determine what the trout eat and therefore what we need to be fishing. As water temperatures go down, trout get less active and bugs get less active. And this is an important distinction that I think some people miss. It's not that there are fewer bugs in the river. That's not really the case, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But it's that they're less active as far as their metamorphosis and their stages of life and their life cycles go. Most bugs are just not that active in cold water. They're not hatching, so you're not seeing pupa and emergers and dry flies popping off all the time. You may see some midge hatches. The midges kind of, they're super tough. They've been around for 18 gajillion eons, and they're adapted to, make love and have babies in any condition, no matter how tough it is. So midges are always around, but the other main types of insects, so your mayfly species, your caddisfly species, and your stonefly species, they're not really doing a whole lot in the winter. There's, some exceptions, right? You might have some BWOs on the mayfly side that are popping off kind of late winter, right as we're turning into spring. You may have those sort of annoying little black snow stoneflies that pop out every now and then, but the fish are never excited to eat them. So exceptions to every rule. But in general, those other insects are just not super duper active during the wintertime. But they're still down there, right? And this is important. You don't have to know the specific Latin names for every single species of caddisfly. You don't need to know all umpteen million species of mayfly. You just need to kind of know the basics. And so here are the basics. In the wintertime, almost everything going on in the bug universe is happening underwater. And most of it is happening in the form of bug larvae. So, mayflies have lifespans, depending on the species, that range from a few months to several years. They can be down there as a larva for a very, very long time. Ditto for caddisflies. They could be down there for a year or longer in their larval stage before they start turning into a real bug and popping up to the surface and letting us fish those amazing elk hairs. Stoneflies, same thing. They can be down there as larvae for like 2 years. I mean, they're really lazy. They just sit down there and do their thing. And it takes quite a while for them to finally crawl up on the rocks and turn into the stoneflies that we are used to seeing and throwing those big chubby Chernobyls and stimulators and everything else. But the trout are still down there and they're still eating these things. So if you can picture these larvae, and again, they vary widely, right? So there's free-moving caddis larvae, there's cased caddis larvae, there are mayfly larvae that burrow into substrate, others that live under rocks. It just depends on the species, but the point is this. You've got all of these larval insects on the bottom of the river who are not dead. They're not going to hatch because the water's too cold and it's not the right time, but they're still down there, and they're kind of hanging on for dear life in most cases. They're living in the current, they're hanging on to rocks, they're hanging onto the substrate, whatever. And they routinely get knocked off. The current knocks them off, or, rocks or pebbles or sticks or whatever float down the river, or other fish come and knock them off, and they get sent flying down the river. Most of the larvae are not amazing swimmers. Some are okay, but most of them are not incredible swimmers, which means that they are flying down the river with the current, and they're sort of helpless. So they float down, the trout position themselves in the current. This is not just in the winter, it's at all times of the year. Position themselves in the current where they have to expend the least amount of energy that they possibly can, but they still get to catch those bugs as they come down the river just in their mouths. It's almost like having a conveyor belt of food coming to your mouth all the time. Now, in the warmer months, the fish are looking at multiple conveyor belts. If you can imagine a conveyor belt on the bottom of the river where you have most of the larval stuff, and then maybe one in the middle of the water column where you have more of the pupa who are starting to emerge and rise up to hatch. Then you have the emergers at the top, which are just starting to break through the surface film to become adult insects. And then you have the actual adults. So, your sailboat mayflies that are floating down the river with those beautiful wings and getting snatched up by hungry trout that are actually willing to come up and break the surface to get them. You got all these conveyor belts stacked up. And during the summer, when the water is warmer and the trout are more active, their metabolisms are more active, they're willing to kind of be greedy, right? They might eat off the bottom conveyor belt for a little bit, and they're going to eat off the middle one, and they're going to eat off the top one, and they're going to go back to the bottom one, and they kind of move up and down the water column. In the wintertime, in most cases, because there's not a lot of activity going on those top three conveyors where you have, the pupa, the emergers, and the dries, they're primarily sitting down on the bottom, partially because the current is slower at the bottom. It's just the way that hydrophysics works. There's less current at the bottom, which means that the fish can hug the bottom and expend comparatively very little energy to hold their position in the river because they're slow and cold and sluggish and tired. But also, they don't need to move because there's not a lot of food above them. Most of the food that they want to eat is going to come bouncing down the riverbed, and they're not going to move very far at all for it. So they might turn their head, to snatch one that's flying by, maybe an inch to their side. Maybe if they're especially hungry and motivated, they might move, 2 inches or 4, maybe 6 inches if they're incredibly motivated and it looks juicy. But they're really not moving much. They are sitting down there conserving energy as if their lives depend on it, because their lives do depend on it, and just eating whatever comes down the conveyor belt on the bottom to them. Your job as a fly fisher in the wintertime is to make sure that your flies are on that bottom conveyor belt. Okay. Now, this does not mean that you can never fish pupa. I do fairly frequently in the wintertime. It doesn't mean that you're never going to see dry fly opportunities in the form of midge hatches, kind of mid-morning or early afternoon. So, I don't mean to imply that this is the only thing you'll ever do, but it's probably what you're going to be doing 90 or 95% of the time in the winter. And so what you really need to be thinking about is, number one, which flies do I need? And as we already have covered, you are probably looking for flies that imitate the larval stage of an insect, and then you got to get them down to depth. And so really, the majority of the winter fly fishing game is about fishing fairly convincing larval patterns as close to the bottom as you possibly can. Which patterns you use, that's up to you, right? You can decide what you want to do. I find in general, and I'll just give you an analogy here, that, if you were standing on one side of a river and you were like waving a single McDonald's chicken nugget at me and you're like, hey man, come get it. And I'm freezing cold and exhausted and just not trying to move. I'm probably going to look at that chicken nugget and be like, I don't know if I want to go all the way over there and get it. And I might just kind of let you pass me by with the chicken nugget. On the other hand, if I'm sitting down there and I haven't eaten for a while and I'm on the other side of the bank and you're over there and you wave a, 24-ounce porterhouse at me and you say, hey, here's a big juicy steak with all these calories in it. Well, then I might get up and I might move. And so to that end, my general philosophy in the wintertime, and again, there are people out there, I'm sure, that will disagree with me. So, my way to fish is not the only way to fish. There are lots of ways to nymph, but I catch a lot of fish doing this, so I feel pretty confident that it is a effective way to get out there in the wintertime. But hey, you do you. I'm just going to explain how I do me. I tend to pair big, juicy flies, the porterhouse steak flies, with little, small chicken nugget flies. I feel like I have the best luck doing that. In most cases, my big, juicy porterhouse fly is a number 10 Pat's rubber legs. I sometimes use a Batman nymph for something else that, still imitates a stonefly of some kind, a stonefly larva of some kind. But I typically tie those pretty big. I mean, we're talking about size 10, maybe I'll go down to a 12, but these are pretty big flies, bigger than you might expect in the wintertime, where a lot of fly fishers have been conditioned to believe that they have to fish nothing but, size 26 midge patterns. You actually can fish larger patterns because those big juicy stonefly nymphs are down there, at least in healthy streams. Stoneflies are not in every stream, so caveat. But as long as you're fishing a healthy stream that does have stoneflies in it, those nymphs and those larvae, they're down there for a year or two at a time. So just because it's the wintertime and there aren't any stoneflies popping off doesn't mean that the fish won't come over and eat them. And if they have to pick between moving, 3 inches for a teeny tiny caddis larva imitation or moving those same 3 inches for a stonefly larva imitation that to their fish brain looks like it would provide 5 times the amount of calories, they're going to be more willing to move for the bigger fly. And to be honest with you, I have days where I primarily catch my fish on this big fly. So it's very, very effective. It also serves another purpose, which is getting the flies down. We're going to talk about how I rig up my leader here in just a couple of minutes. But, as I mentioned, you got to get your flies down to that bottom conveyor belt. And that means you're going to have to use weight, right? Unweighted flies just aren't going to get down there. Or at least they're not going to get down there fast enough to be useful for you over the course of let's say at most 20 to 30 foot drift. You got to get them down. You got to get them down pretty quickly. That requires weight. You have 2 ways to do that. You can either use split shot, and I sometimes do use split shot. Lots of guys swear by it. Or you can use really heavy flies. I prefer the latter. I believe that simple is almost always better. The fewer things I can put on my line, I think the better off I'm going to be. And so this big sort of lead pattern, my point fly, is going to be something with a lot of weight on it. If it's a rubber legs, I have probably 0.020 lead wire wrapped almost all the way up the shank. Plus, in a lot of cases, a pretty big beadhead on there. Beadheads get eaten all the time. Sometimes I think that the fish aren't even eating the fly because it looks like a bug. They just see something shiny floating down the river and decide they want to eat it. But I've never experimented with it, so maybe we'll save that for another day. But the beadhead and the lead wire are there just to sink this thing down to the bottom. I want to get it as close as I possibly can. And then off the back of that porterhouse steak, I am putting a small fly. This could be, and it depends on where I am. It sort of depends on my mood. It depends on what the fish are doing. I typically start with some type of midge larva pattern. Very often it's just a straight up zebra midge in black or red. Sometimes it is a top secret midge. Sometimes it is a black beauty. There are a few different patterns that might sort of find themselves hanging off the backside of that big heavy point fly, but I want it to be smaller. I want it to be lighter. And the goal is that the point fly is getting almost down to the bottom, and then you have this other smaller fly, your chicken nugget fly, trailing along behind it, a little bit higher in the water column. So not quite ticking the bottom, but just kind of trailing along behind it, where I think it gets a little bit nicer and more natural of a drift and is still available to the fish. And like I said, this pattern can be whatever you want. It's often a midge. Midges are a huge part of trout diets all the time, but they're especially important in the wintertime, even though I hate them. And I believe that they are the most irritating aquatic insect out there. Midges are super important, and they are doubly important in the wintertime. So starting with the midge pattern is never a bad idea. If they're not doing that for whatever reason, then you've got a whole bunch of different options. I have several different caddis larva patterns that I will tie on that work very well in the wintertime because, again, caddis larvae are down there all the time, available to the trout all the time, and they work pretty regularly. It could be a hare's ear, which could imitate anything from a caddis larva to a mayfly larva to a sort of nondescript, buggy-looking, who knows what the hell that is larva. They're great. Sometimes I'll just use a straight-up attractor pattern there. If they're just not eating a more natural-looking fly, I might throw my old, faithful prince nymph on there. I might throw a rainbow warrior on there. I might do a whole bunch of crazy things that the fish aren't eating because at some point, if they're going to be that picky, it's just sort of let's see what they'll take. But I usually start with the midge. And that's kind of my default fly setup. So when I roll up to the river out there in the wintertime, this is probably what I have going on. The idea being that, sometimes the fish just straight up eat the porterhouse. I catch a lot of fish in the dead of winter on really big patterns. And I believe it's because they look like juicy meals. But sometimes they go up to that and they're like, I don't know, that looks suspicious. And then as they turn their head, they're like, but wait, it's a chicken nugget. And they'll eat that thing. It's like the bait and switch sort of thing. I've heard people call it. I don't know if that's exactly true. I don't really know if there's any science behind it. I've never stuck an underwater camera down there to actually watch a fish do this. So, it could be bullshit, but I think it happens sometimes. And I've seen enough interesting fish behavior with this setup in really clear water that I do believe that they will sometimes skip that big fly and go for the smaller fly afterward. Don't know why, but hey, I don't care. I just want to catch the fish. So as long as they eat a fly, I'm a happy camper. So that's my default fly setup. Let's talk about sort of the rig itself and how I have all of that set up. So in general, and let's actually just back up all the way and talk about the whole equipment setup here. I am typically fishing a 5-weight or a 6-weight in the wintertime. During the summertime, I don't think you need rods that heavy. Everybody loves to say that, the 9-foot 5-weight is the only rod you ever need and it's great for everything. It will do everything that you want it to do. I don't disagree with that. I don't think it's the best rod for everything. In the summertime, I'm typically carrying 3 and 4-weight rods. I don't need or want a 5-weight for most of the stuff I'm doing in the summer, even with bigger fish. In the wintertime, the 5-weight's great, but sometimes if you're slinging, real big heavy rigs, like with these big heavy flies on them and an indicator and everything else, I appreciate the extra backbone of a 6-weight. And so I either am fishing a 9-foot, 5-inch Orvis Blackout 5-weight, which is a really weird length rod, but I love it because that extra 5 inches really gives you some extra reach, takes some of the hassle out of mending, and it's a beautiful rod. So don't get me wrong. I love that thing. I've fished it for many seasons. But I also fish a 9-foot 6-weight. And that 6-weight, it's overkill as far as the size of the fish go. But to be honest with you, I think there's a misconception among a lot of fly fishers that your rod weight has something to do with the size of the fish that you're catching. I guess if you're fishing saltwater, there's a universe where, if you're going to catch a 200-pound tarpon, maybe you do need a 12-weight because it's a flipping 200-pound tarpon, right? But if you're fishing for trout, maybe you get into a 28-inch monster somewhere and wish you had a bigger rod. I'm not saying that can't happen, but it's probably not going to happen, right? Most of your trout in real life are somewhere between 8 inches and 15 inches. Anything bigger than that's pretty good. But even up to 20 inches, I've caught 20-plus inch fish on little dinky 7.5-foot 3-weight rods. So, the size of the fish is not necessarily the deciding factor. The deciding factor really is what you're throwing with the rod. So that 6-weight is not necessarily because I'm expecting to go out and catch a hog every single time I hit the water in the winter, but because I know I'm throwing big, heavy, clunky rigs. I'm not casting these beautiful, lightweight, delicate dry flies. I'm slinging meat. Like, there's weight on the line. It's almost like I'm throwing lures, right? And I know that that's sacrilege to many of us fly fishers, but, it's not a lot different in practice than throwing Rapalas out there as far as the weight and the motions and everything else that's going on. Sometimes having a stronger, stiffer rod with a little bit more backbone in it does wonders for you, especially if you're having to pick these things up. Maybe they're really deep in the water column. You got to pick them up all the way through that water column and flip them back upstream. You're going to be doing that all day, right? Because you're going to be casting a lot in the wintertime. It's just the nature of the game. The easier it is for you, less your arm's going to hurt, happier you're going to be, longer you can fish. So don't rule out the 6-weight. Heavier is not bad. You do what you want to do on the rod side, but 9-foot 6-weight or a 9.5-foot 5-weight, pretty much my go-to. As far as the line goes, I am just running regular old weight forward floating line. There are guys who get real deep into using sink line, especially if they're doing, or sink tip line, I should say, if they're doing streamers in the wintertime. I don't think you should be doing a lot of streamers in the wintertime if you're fishing in cold environments, because it's a guaranteed way to get your fingers super cold, put ice in your guides, and get line ice going on. But if you're somewhere warmer and you want to fish streamers, knock yourself out. You want to do it on a sink tip line or a full sink line, knock yourself out. I just fish straight up, weight forward, floating line. That's all I need, right? That is attached to a sealed drag reel. Now, there's a lot that we could talk about with reels. I'm not necessarily saying that you have to go out and buy a $1,000 Hardy reel. You don't necessarily need to do that, but I do think it's worth spending some money on sealed drag, because if you don't have a sealed drag system, you can get ice in there. So if it gets wet, you catch a fish, you drop the reel down the water, it gets some water on it and in it, and then it freezes. Well, now your reel is going to freeze. And if you do happen to hook that hog and your reel is frozen up and stuck, that means your drag can't work. It means that you're not going to be able to let out any line. The fish can't pull any line. And as most of you probably know, if the fish can't pull any line and it's that size, it's probably going to break you off, or you're going to lose the fish. They're going to spit the hook. So a sealed drag reel that is able to kind of keep that ice out of the inner workings of your drag system is going to be your friend. So if you got to spend a couple extra bucks on that, doesn't have to be gold, doesn't have to have your grandfather's name printed on it or hand engraved, but do get a decent reel for the wintertime, because if you don't, eventually you may have a bad time when it comes to really cold conditions and ice. And then from there, I have just a standard 9-foot 4X tapered extruded leader. That's a lot of words, right? So let me break that down for you. When I say tapered extruded leader, I mean the kind that I take out of a bag because I bought it online. You can use Rio leaders, you can use Scientific Anglers leaders, you can use Orvis leaders. There are a bunch of different really good brands out there, but the central unifying feature of these things is that it is a single monofilament nylon line that has been extruded from a machine as a single piece. And so it starts real thick and heavy up in the butt section that attaches to the fly line. It gradually tapers down to that 4X tippet at the very end of the leader, and that's all you need. If you want to tie your own leaders, you can totally tie your own leaders. I have experimented with this. I know that there are other guys out there, including some who have podcasts, who love to tie their own leaders and even to sell their own hand-tied leaders because they're into Euro nymphing and tight lining and all that stuff. I don't really Euro nymph. I don't really tight line. I have done it. I don't enjoy it, to be honest. I'd rather just indicator nymph if I'm going to be out there doing it. But hey, to each their own. And you can totally tie your own leaders. Even if you're indicator nymphing, you can tie your own leaders. You can go buy, 7 different types of monofilament line and then tie them all together beautifully and make your own thing. And that's cool. I mean, fly fishing is all about customizing your stuff, doing your thing, being creative. And so if you're into that, I don't mean to take that away from you at all. I just don't do it because I can buy a pack of 4 of these things for like $12, and then I don't go through them for probably at least 3 months, maybe as many as 6 months, depending on how hard I'm fishing them. And I just find that they work better. Simpler for me is almost always better. The harder something gets, the more complicated something gets, the less likely it is that I'm going to do it, the more likely it is that I'm going to get annoyed. And so a plain old tapered, extruded 4X leader is all I use in the wintertime. And to be honest with you, most of what I use for the other seasons, so I don't even have to change it up too much between the seasons. That runs down to a 2mm small tippet ring. If you are not using tippet rings, then I think you're doing it wrong. And I know you're going to get mad and throw eggs at me for saying that, but these things are like the best invention ever. If you're not using a tippet ring, then what happens is you are attaching your final tippet section, your sort of terminal tackle, directly to the tippet section of the leader with a double surgeon or a triple surgeon or whatever you happen to be tying on there. And that's okay. I mean, it works and it works fine. But the problem is that those knots use leader. So every time you change your flies, every time you break off, anytime anything happens, you're cutting back that leader. And after you've cut it back too much, so let's say you've cut it back to, 7 feet or something like that, you're kind of back into the thicker section, the butt section. It's not as long as you need it to be, and it just isn't useful to you anymore. So, well, now that leader's dead, and you got to get rid of it and get a new one. The tippet ring makes that not happen, right? So if you tie a tippet ring to the end of that leader, that means that the tippet ring is forever sort of the end of the leader. You're not cutting the leader back. You're just attaching your terminal tippet and your terminal tackle to the tippet ring itself. And that means that you very rarely have to cut back your leader. And there are a bunch of benefits to that. Number one is that you don't have to be messing around with leader changes in the middle of the day, which can be annoying. Number two, you don't have to buy tons of leaders, right? I mean, I have leaders that I'll put on there, and honest to God, I don't think I change them unless there's a knot in them or some type of abrasion or clear damage on it, I probably don't change those things more than once every few months, to be honest with you, because I don't need to. They don't get any shorter. They're in perfectly good condition, and I just keep on fishing them. Easier for me and saves me money. Kind of hard to complain. So really do look into those tippet rings. And you want to get the 2mm size, the small size. And then I tie those onto my leader with a single uni knot. Everybody who's ever been fishing, no matter what kind of fishing it is, probably knows how to tie a uni knot. It's kind of one of those super famous, very well known, very well respected fishing knots that really should be in your arsenal. You can look up how to do it online if you need to, but a uni knot is what I use there. It's great. Tie it on nice and neat. Cut that tag in pretty short so it's not getting hung up in vegetation or whatever else down there, and have that tippet ring hanging off the end with the uni knot. Then I am taking my spool of 5X fluorocarbon tippet, and I am attaching that directly to the tippet ring. I use fluorocarbon because, well, for two reasons. The first is that fluorocarbon is a little bit tougher than nylon, a little bit tougher than monofilament. It tends to be more abrasion resistant. That's very helpful when you are fishing toward the bottom because you're going to be scraping that line up against rocks and stumps and sticks and all manner of stuff. But the other thing with fluorocarbon is that it sinks more rapidly than monofilament. So anytime you're fishing subsurface, fluorocarbon tends to be a little bit better of a choice in terms of sink rate. Do I think that it really matters? No, not really. I mean, your flies or your split shot are doing most of the work of getting you down into that strike zone. But hey, a little bit of extra sinking power doesn't hurt. So I like to use fluorocarbon here. I use 5X. I tend to believe that in almost all applications, 5X is about as small as you ever need to go. It is, to me, the perfect balance between sturdiness and breaking strength and being unobtrusive and unoffensive to the trout enough that it's not messing up the bite. There's a big and probably valid debate about whether or not trout actually care about tippet or line of any kind, but we can get into that another time. For now, we can just say that 5X tippet works just fine. So I tie that 5X tippet onto the bottom side of the same tippet ring using a single Davy knot. If you don't know how to use a Davy knot, if you don't know how to tie a Davy knot, you got to go look it up right now. So if you're still out there tying clinch knots and improved clinch knots and, whatever else you happen to be tying, I can basically guarantee you that the Davy knot is simpler and easier and faster to tie. It has roughly the same breaking strength as many of those knots. I've caught some really big fish on single Davy knots tied in 5X. And as long as you tie it right, it's so quick, it's so easy, and it just is going to change your life. So go look up a Davy knot because you're going to be glad that you did. But the reason I tie that one on the bottom side of the tippet ring and not another uni knot is on purpose. The uni knot is objectively stronger than a Davy knot. It's going to take more to break it. Because you are fishing lower in the column in the wintertime, you're going to get snagged. You just are. It's going to happen. You're going to catch vegetation. You're going to get hooked on sticks and logs and rocks and whatever else. It's just part of fishing down close to the bottom because, there's stuff on the bottom of the river. If you get stuck badly enough that you need to break off your flies because you can't retrieve them, having that uni knot up top and the Davy knot on the bottom of the tippet ring almost guarantees that the Davy knot will break first, which means that you will lose your flies. They'll break off, but you're going to get your whole leader back plus the tippet ring because that knot is a little bit stronger. That saves you the hassle of having to put on another tippet ring, saves you the hassle of having your leader break, and just generally makes your life easier. So Davy knot's the way to go there. I run about a foot or so, maybe a little less, 10 inches, a 5X tippet down to that first juicy porterhouse fly, which is probably a stone fly. I tie a Davy knot to that one through the eye. I tie another Davy knot onto the bend of that hook, and I run anywhere from 12 to 18 inches of additional tippet down to my trailer fly, which again is a fairly small fly. Now, I usually just use 5X tippet for that trailer fly as well. I find that I don't have any trouble tying on flies down to about a size 22 with 5X. It fits fine through the eye hole. It's not a big deal. I don't see a reason to downsize it. I've played with it. I don't know that it has any impact on, catch rate or anything else that I would care about. So 5X is usually fine for that. If you are fishing an incredibly tiny fly, and there are times in the winter where you've got to get down to fishing, those insane like size 26 midge patterns that you can barely hold, then you might need to go to 6X, right? There are times where you might need to downsize to 6X just to be able to get the fly on there effectively. But as far as, this sort of belief that you've got to fish like, at 7X, at 8X tippet, and, then beyond that tippet that's so small that I'm not even totally sure it exists, I just don't think that's true. I really don't. If you're fishing for trout that are selective enough that they can distinguish between 6X tippet and 8.5X tippet, then I might submit that there are better places to go fishing. But I don't think that is a major factor. If you're not catching fish 99% of the time, it doesn't have anything to do with your tippet. It has to do with you, and your technique probably sucks. Sorry, hate to be the guy that tells you that, but that's probably the truth. So that's my setup as far as getting everything on the line. Now, depending on how fast the water is or how deep I need to get it, I might add a single split shot about 6 inches above that point fly, that heavy point fly. If I do that, it's probably like a number 8 size split shot, which is a really teeny tiny split shot. Very rarely I might add a second one of those, but I don't even know for sure that I remember the last time that I did that. I don't do it often, and the only time I would do it is if I am fishing a scenario where I have to get the flies down super fast. So faster than that lead wrap, beadhead, point fly can get them down. That could be sort of heavy whitewater. It could be sections where I'm getting short drifts, but I need to get it down to 4 or 5 or 6 feet. There are times for it, but I try to avoid it wherever I can because, again, simple is better. The less stuff you have on your line, the easier it'll be to detect strikes. And also just the easier it'll be to rig and re-rig if you have to break it off. Up above that, I have the indicator. And this will kind of serve as a good segue into, the mechanics and the tactics of actually fishing in the wintertime. I use airlock indicators. They are, if you haven't seen them, they're like little foam balls. I use the small size. I will say that. So these are the smallest size that they make. I don't think those big ones are necessary. You can see the small ones just fine in most cases, and they make way less of a disturbance when you put them down on the water. But they are little foam balls, and you put your leader down through a channel in the cap of the ball, and then there's a screw-on lid with a gasket that you just cinch down over the line to hold it in place. The gasket kind of keeps the line from getting damaged, and then when you need to change where the indicator is on your line, which you're going to do often, you just unscrew the cap a little bit, you slide it up or down to where you need it, you tighten it up again, you're ready to rock. There are a whole bunch of other types of indicators you can use. You could use a thingamabobber. Those are fine. You can use the Oros things. They're the little foam balls that look like airlocks, but they're like if you split a golf ball in half and the line goes through the middle and then you screw them back together. They're okay too. I find them a little harder to work with, and I've dropped an awful lot of those halves into the water and then custom myself because they're actually fairly expensive. You have Dorsey yarn indicators, which are awesome, and I love them. Except for the fact that because they are yarn, they get wet, and because we're fishing in the wintertime, that yarn can freeze, which means that if you were in cold water and cold air temperatures, those yarn indicators are very likely not the right thing for you to be using. But really, in the end, I don't care what indicator you use, right? The point is that you need to have an indicator if you're going to be indicator nymphing, and you need to be able to adjust the indicator. Now, why do you need to be able to adjust the indicator? You need to be able to adjust the indicator because you are going to be constantly changing the depth of your flies. Now, if you're tight lining or Euro nymphing, you can ignore all this stuff because you are just sort of manually controlling the depth of your flies. By keeping a tight line on it, raising the rod up or down, you are sort of controlling at a very detailed level where they are in real time. Indicator rigs are less finessey. I know that's not a word, but we're going to say it anyway. In that you're not really controlling the depth. The indicator is controlling the depth, right? So those heavy flies are going to sink as low as the indicator allows it. The indicator is acting, as the trout bitten guys might say, as a suspender, and it is basically hanging those flies down below it at a specified depth. So if you can imagine the line kind of hanging off the indicator, it's hanging down at an angle, obviously because it's in the current, so it's probably not hanging straight down because you're not fishing still water. And where the indicator sits determines how deeply those flies ride in the water column. So if you are fishing really shallow water, you're going to have that indicator really far down on your line. And I mean, there are times where I'm fishing maybe a foot of water or a foot and a half of water. I might have that indicator all the way down to within, I don't know, 5 or 6 inches of the tippet ring, so that, the flies are riding and just barely ticking the bottom as they go through. And I should mention that you don't want the flies dragging on the bottom. That's not going to be terribly effective and is going to lead to a lot of snags. You want to hit that sweet spot where they're close enough to the bottom that they are occasionally ticking the bottom, but not so close to the bottom that they're just getting scraped along, like a wrecking ball or whatever. So if you're fishing shallow water, real close to the flies. If you're fishing medium depth water, you move it up by however many feet or inches you need to. Really deep water, you may have that indicator like all the way up on your leader, depending on how deep you want to get. There's a lot of sort of aphorisms out there about how to handle this. Some people say that your indicator should be 1.5 times the depth of the water. Other people say it should be 2 times the depth of the water. Other people say it should be blah, 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 blah. What I know about fly fishing is that most of it is a lie, and most of the sort of hard and fast things that you hear about don't work in practice, right? So let me give you the totally unscientific way to decide where to place your indicator. You look at the water, you decide how deep the water is, and then you guess on your leader where you should put the indicator to get your flies to approximately within 1 inch or 2 inches of the bottom of the stream. You're probably going to get it wrong. So maybe your first drift, you sort of hit the bottom and it hangs up. Well, maybe you want to move it down a couple of inches, move the indicator down a couple of inches to buy yourself some extra space. Maybe it floats all the way through and never touches the bottom once and you don't see any activity. Well, that might be an indication that you want to move the indicator up your line and let those flies sink a little bit deeper. You're going to kind of have to eyeball this. If there's clear water and you're fishing beatheads, you might be able to see where the flies are, and that's incredibly helpful when it's the case. But if not, you might just be kind of doing some guesswork. And, the longer you do this, the better you're going to get at the guesswork. At this stage of the game, I can largely eyeball a piece of water, and without thinking through any numbers about, okay, it needs to be 1.5 times the depth, without any of that stuff, I can pretty much decide where the indicator needs to be on the line just from experience. If it's wrong, I fix it, but very often it's not. You're going to be fishing, in almost all cases, sort of slower, deeper water that is anywhere from, 1.5 to 4 feet deep. Maybe there are a few times where you might get into the shallower stuff, but for the most part, that's where you're going to be, which means that your indicator is not going to move a ton, right? It might move a couple of feet up or down your line. In most cases, it's probably going to move up or down a couple of inches. You're going to figure it out pretty quickly. So don't stress about having it in the right place, but do be willing to move it. There are some people who just absolutely will not move their indicators. They don't want to, they're lazy about it, and they just feel like, whatever, it'll be fine. It might not be fine. So where your indicator sits on your line really matters, partially because if it's positioned wrong, then your flies are likely not riding in the correct place, and that means they're not likely to get eaten. But also because the indicator, and this might surprise you, is what indicates when a fish eats your flies, right? So if you think about this, let's say you have your big heavy fly down there, you've got your lighter trailer fly trailing behind that, maybe you have some split shot up above that point fly, and then you've got the indicator. And let's say the indicator is like 4 feet up on your leader. If a fish eats that little tiny fly, turns his head and he just sort of, swoop, like sips it, that movement has to move the big heavy fly in front of that small fly, the split shot, and then all of that leader all the way up to the indicator and make the indicator do something. The something might be tiny, right? So, most strikes in the wintertime are pretty subtle. You need to be setting the hook on the indicator anytime you see anything weird. So if it stops for a second, set the hook. Cannot tell you how many fish I have caught just because the indicator sort of stops for a split second and I think maybe I'm hung up and bam, it's a fish. If it rolls over, set the hook. If it twitches, set the hook. If it does anything that is not just floating nicely down the river, just set the hook. But here's the thing. Those strikes are so subtle that you can miss them if you mess this up. And if there is too much stuff between the fly that the fish ate and the indicator, and you are not adjusting for that, you're going to miss a lot of fish because you just aren't going to see anything happen. Either it's never going to translate up the line to the indicator, or it's going to be so tiny and so subtle that you're going to miss it, or you're going to see it so late that you don't have time to set the hook before the fish has already spat that fly out, because they often, they eat these things and they're like, ooh, that's not food, and they spit it out, and you have a second maybe to set the hook. Where your indicator sits will directly impact how many fish you catch. So if you go out there and you just want to set it and forget it and never touch your indicator again, you're probably not going to catch a ton of fish unless you're going to limit the types and the depths of water you're going to fish. You should be adjusting the indicator all day. Like if you move on from a spot, adjust the indicator. If you go to the next spot, adjust the indicator. If you're not catching any fish, adjust the indicator. Before you change flies, before you change tippet, before you, rend your clothing and, scream at the heavens, change your depth. And that means changing where your indicator is positioned. The indicator is the thing that you are fishing. Your flies are down there, sure, and it pays to know where they are, but you're fishing the indicator, and that is the number one thing for you to be thinking about. Don't be lazy about it, because if you are, you're going to pay for it with your catch rate. Now, let's say that you have all of this stuff set up correctly. You have the flies down there, you have the indicator on there, everything's going great, you're adjusting it, you feel good. How exactly do you go about fishing water in the winter? Well, as you know, fish are not in the same places in the winter that they are in the warmer months. So you're not going to find as many fish in those real shallow riffles where they're hanging out in the summer months. You aren't going to find fish as spread out in the river as you do in the warmer months. You're going to find them fairly well clustered together in generally slower, deeper water. And that slower, deeper water can take a lot of forms. It could be, the sort of foamy tail out at the end of a run. It could be a glide in between a pool and a run. It could be a pool itself. It could be a whole bunch of different things. And regardless of where it is, you should be or it could be bank water. I should mention that, they do still hang out by the banks, especially right off of major current seams, but they're probably going to be in slower, deeper stuff than they would otherwise. And that's your primary target. One note, really, really deep stuff, the fish might not be feeding. So if you find a pool and it's crazy, 6, 7, 8, 10 feet deep, the fish down there that you see might not be eating. You can try for them, and I have caught fish in those places, but they may not be eating if they're sitting that deep. And so don't be surprised if you find fish who just aren't going to eat your flies. I mean, I've hit fish in the face with my flies in the wintertime, and they won't eat it. Not every fish is eating. If you find that, just move on to the next thing. But you're generally targeting that type of water. And then you got to remember that in the wintertime, your accuracy window shrinks a ton. So, in the summer, you could pop a dry fly into a section, maybe it's a seam, maybe it's a pocket, whatever it happens to be. And you've got a little bit of leeway. As long as your drift is okay, if there's a fish down there and he's within, 2 or 3 feet, he may well move to come up for the dry or come eat the nymph as your dropper or whatever. But he's willing to kind of be a good sport. He's willing to move around and come over and put some effort into it. Wintertime, they're not going to do that. You're just not going to see these fish move very much at all. And that means that you've got this really, really tight window, small target that you're aiming for with your casts. And that means two things. Number one, your cast really matters. And this is especially true when you have a bunch of weight at the end of your line. If your casting stroke sucks, or if you're trying to do the traditional 10-2 fly cast with that big heavy indicator rig on there, you are going to have a bad time. You're going to smack your rod with heavy flies or split shot, which might lead to a break. You're going to hit yourself in the back of the head with that stuff. You're going to tail it and have tailing loops all over the place. You're going to tangle. You're going to hit branches. You can't really cast like that, at least not super effectively in the wintertime. Instead, you're going to spend a lot of time roll casting or a lot of time doing the water load. And for those of you who don't know what the water load is, that's where you cast, you let it drift down past you, which is okay with an indicator, because remember, the indicator is controlling the drift, not necessarily you. So as long as you're not messing with the indicator, you can actually let it swing a little bit downstream. And I very often will catch fish on that swing either after it's past me or at the end of the line when the flies kind of start rising up downstream of the indicator. But you're going to let it go down. You're going to let the water pull on the line so it's loading your rod, and then you're just going to flick it right back up and get another drift. This is especially helpful if you're trying to avoid line ice because you don't have a bunch of line swinging around in the air all the time. You have a fixed length of line. You are putting it up there. You're watching it drift downstream past you. You're letting the water load your rod. And then you're flicking it back up there. It's the easiest thing in the world. It's arguably not fly casting at all. But it works. It works for getting that kind of heavy stuff out there and making sure that you're slinging your meat in the right places. Well, that didn't sound very good. Maybe I should rephrase it. But no, we'll stick with it. Slinging your meat in the right places. So don't be out there trying to do like a river runs through it where you're trying to draw hearts in the air for your girlfriend. Just, utilitarian flick cast and roll cast and water load cast. That's what you want to be doing most of the time in the winter. And once you do that, you need to get accurate with those casts, which is just a matter of practice. And trust me, it is harder than you think to be accurate, especially with all that weight on the line. But once you can nail that down, you need to start thinking like a mathematician. Maybe that's not the right analogy, but I'll tell you what I mean. You need to break the water down even more than you do in the summer months because you have to cover it, right? So what you know is you've got to get it within a few inches of whatever trout happen to be sitting down there. That means that you've got to hit all those individual windows. Okay, so you can't just throw a couple of decent drifts through a 10-foot section or a 10-foot seam and hope that you are going to get a fish. You're going to have to be confident before you move on that you have shown the fly to as many fish as you can. And that means you're going to have to kind of pick it apart. So in general, what I do is I'll break it up into about 6-inch sections. So let's say that I'm looking at a tail out, right? I will break that tail out. Maybe the tail out is, 6 feet across, at least the current section. And I'll break it up into a whole bunch of different 6-inch lanes. I will start with the lane closest to me. I'll get a good drift through that lane. Maybe I'll even do 2 drifts through that lane just to be sure. I'll let the flies float down, I'll water load, I put it back up, and I move it 6 inches over to the right or to the left, whichever side of the river I happen to be on. And I'll do a few drifts in there, and then I'll pick it up and I'll move it 6 inches over, and I'll keep doing that. And I'll just work my way across, almost like a fan pattern across that water to make sure that I really showed it to whichever fish are down there. And it's amazing because you will very often, maybe you don't catch a fish on that first 6-inch lane, but you catch one on the very next lane with almost exactly the same drift just because the flies missed him by 2 inches before. And he looked at him and went, I'm not going over there. But you move them over 2 inches, you catch the fish. If you break it up into too many lanes, you miss them again, right? So let's say that you miss them on that first lane and then you move it over 2 feet. Well, now you skip the fish, right? So you moved it 2 feet past him. He's not going to move for that either. Now you don't catch the fish. So being able to fish these sort of micro lanes and really, really focus on splitting up that water and covering the water is going to dramatically increase your catch rate in the wintertime. If you don't do that, you're going to miss a lot of fish. It is slower. It is more methodical. It takes time. I think I've mentioned before that, warmer months, I could cover 4 or 5 miles of stream over the course of a day because I'm just ripping upstream through that thing and, popping a good dry fly in here, popping a good dry fly in there. And then I'm like, oh, they saw it. I'm moving on. Wintertime, you got to be more methodical. So I might only cover a mile, or even less than that over the course of the day because I am sitting there just picking apart these likely places and making sure that I have shown my flies to as many fish as there might be down there. Be methodical about it, okay? Take your time in the wintertime. You don't have to rush. There's not some amazing thing up ahead of you. The whole river is going to be kind of slow. Be technical, be accurate, be methodical, and just pick that water apart. And you're going to start catching fish that you would have missed otherwise, I pretty much guarantee you. So make your brain sort of click into that mode. And then when you do catch a fish, note where you caught the fish. When I catch one in the wintertime, really anytime, but let's, winter especially, I'm making note of 2 things: water depth, current speed. Water depth, I'm just kind of looking at it and going, I'd say that's about 2 feet of water. And current speed, I just sort of break up into a scale of 5, right? With 1 being like no current at all. It's basically just a totally dead pool with nothing going on. to 5, which is a raging rapid, right? And so I'll look at it and I'll pick up a, rainbow here, a rainbow there, or a brown over there. And I'll make a mental note to myself and be like, okay, that's 3 feet and about a 3 in current. Or maybe it's 2 feet and about a 2 in current. But I keep those in the back of my mind because fish are pretty predictable. And so if you're finding fish in that particular water type in a river, you can be pretty confident that you're going to keep finding fish in that water type as you make your way upstream. So making a mental note of it is perfect, because otherwise you get so excited that you caught a fish, you might kind of forget where you caught that fish. And then you're just going back to basically prospecting and picking apart all the likely spots. Whereas if you make a mental note of it, if you remember, then you're going to be able to spend your time more accurately and in a more focused fashion, picking out the water types where there are fish and there are feeding fish. And that is going to dramatically increase your catch rate. Now, the last thing I'm going to say, because I've been talking for close to an hour about this stuff, and I think there's only so much technical stuff we can do in a single podcast, but I will say one more thing. You need to adjust your expectations in the wintertime, okay? You're not going to catch as many fish in the winter as you do in the summer. You just aren't. That makes intuitive sense to a lot of people. But listen, if you're like a hardcore, super sexy fly fishing dude or girl, and you go out there and you're catching, you're used to catching 15, 20, 25, 30 fish a day because you're a badass and they just can't hide from you, you're going to be pretty disappointed when you go out in the winter and expect the same thing. I still have double-digit days in the wintertime. It does happen, and when it happens, I'm obviously excited about it. But you're very often going to catch fewer fish, and it's not uncommon to go out. Maybe you only catch 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 over the course of the day. Some days, if the conditions are really tough, depending on the stream, you might only catch a few. And some days, to be honest, you may go out there and you can't find a feeding fish and you go home getting skunked. That won't happen super often if you're being methodical and approaching this carefully, but it can happen to you, and you just got to adjust your expectations. Okay, so you're out there for less time. The window is shorter. You're probably out there from like mid-morning until mid-afternoon. It's kind of half-day season for a lot of this stuff. And then you're getting out of there. The bug activity is limited. The fish are tired and sluggish. It's not quite the same game. And the more you adjust your expectations, the more you will be able to go out and enjoy winter fly fishing for what it is, which is a beautiful, challenging, fun, different experience in fly fishing, and not a sort of hyper competitive way to catch fish and catch a bunch of fish the way that you would in, a different environment or a different month. So go in there with realistic expectations, expect a lower catch rate, but you can still catch fish. And man, if you're like me, you got to get out there and catch fish. I may not love winter fly fishing all the time, but I also am not going to not fish. So I got to get out there, hit the streams, and I got to feel that tug on the rod. I need to see the fish in the net. That's my therapy, and I got to be out there. So I'm guessing you probably feel the same way. It is starting to get cold here. This episode will go up toward the end of December, and that means it's probably getting pretty cold where you are. I was just driving down the highway today and checking out one of my favorite freestones, and it's, parts of it are frozen up entirely and the rest is getting pretty darn close. So we're getting into the heart of winter here. I am hoping that this episode gave you some tools and some tactics and some information about how to go out there and be effective in this really cold section of time that's coming up to us. And then we're going to pivot a little bit and talk about some other stuff. So the good news for you is that this is the last episode that you have to listen to me talk on my own. The remaining episodes of the season are going to be interviews with various guests. We'll be talking about avalanche safety. We'll be talking about staying in shape for the summer hiking season during the winter. We will be talking about how to plan for your initial backcountry trips, especially trips up to high alpine lakes. And then we might have a real special guest who wants to come to us and talk specifically about how to be an amazing fly fisherman on tailwaters. But all interviews from here on out. I hope that you have enjoyed the first half of the season. I'm really looking forward to the second half. If you have time, I'd love for you to give me a 5-star rating on Apple or Spotify. I hate to ask for that, and I kind of swore that I wouldn't, but I don't know. It does help, And so if you feel so inclined and you enjoy the podcast, that would be great. If you would like to ask a question, or you have anything to say, or you just think that I'm an asshole or wrong, feel free to shoot me a note and let me know. That's cool. No problem. No worries. And otherwise, I hope you can get out there, stay warm, keep fishing, and we'll see you soon. Till next time, this is Ross. Maybe I'll see you out there. Don't forget to set the hook.